So, I'm here with Jeff Juris, who's Professor of Anthropology at Northeastern University in Boston. Thanks for having us here today, by the way.
Yeah, welcome.
So I'm just wondering if we could start with a very basic question, which is if you could give a one sentence or so answer to what is anthropology?
Oh, I knew you were going to ask this. So I think anthropology is, on the one hand, a perspective. It's about valuing sort of local knowledge and learning about the world based on how people understand the world and their place within it. So we take meaning seriously. And so it's about being interested not just in sort of objective kinds of relationships, but people's everyday experience and how that everyday experience allows them to learn about their place within the world, learn how to interact in the world, and so how larger kinds of phenomenon build up from the kind of local level and the experiential level. So it's a perspective based on meaning and everyday life. It's also a method based on long-term participant observation. So living with a group of people for a long time and realizing that if what we're interested in is meaning and culture and people's everyday lives, then we have to live that. We have to sort of experience the world as other people do. And so taking that seriously. So the idea is that we can't sort of make broad statements about things, from being far away or from looking at statistics, that how people go about their lives every day is really where understanding comes from. And so anthropology, I think, brings those two things together, this perspective about meaning and culture in everyday life, with a method for studying it, which is actually living with a group of people and learning how they learn and understand the world, and taking that seriously.
So how did you come to be involved in anthropology or interested in it in the first place?
The first time I heard the word anthropology was actually on a trip I took as a pre-high school, junior high school student, I guess you would call it. And it was actually a science trip. We were in Florida learning about marine biology and ecology and stuff like that. And this woman was interested in anthropology, and I had no idea what that was. For her, it was about sort of mythology and how people relate to things, and she had done some wacky program in upstate New York, and she was like, you should really study this. The mythology is really important, interesting, and I kind of filed it away. I'm not a new age kind of person at all. But I remembered this term anthropology, and when I was in college, I decided to sort of look it up. And so I looked up the anthropology department. And we actually didn't have a typical introduction to anthropology where I went to school. It was sort of, you would just take a class and it would be for a beginning group. But the other thing I was interested in college was politics. And so I had become active politically in high school during the peace movement, and Reagan was president, and we thought we were all going to die in a nuclear war, and we needed to do something about that. And so I wanted to study politics, but so I started taking classes, and the political science classes were dry, the history classes were boring, and then I took this anthropology class. And it wasn't really about mythology or anything like that. It was about politics, but from the perspective of people's everyday lives. And that's when I realized that this was it. This is what I wanted to study. And so that's how I came to it.
So obviously that political take on anthropology has been something that's shaped the way that you've moved through it in terms of your work. So I'm just wondering if you could talk us through when you started to do your PhD in anthropology, what were the sorts of things you were starting to look at through the anthropological lens, and how it was that your study was anthropological as opposed to political or historical?
For sure. Yeah, I mean, let me back up, I guess. So part of my interest in anthropology was political, but I'm also very interested in philosophy and theory. So the other thing I didn't like about political science and history was that there wasn't too much theory that we were looking at. And so anthropology was interesting both because it was about people's everyday lives, but it also provided a theoretical perspective for understanding meaning, culture, and power. And so I've always been interested in both of those levels. So I'm very academic in one sense, but also very political in another sense. And that tension, I think, is interesting. And anthropology is a place where you can actually think about that tension. So how did I come to this? So when I was an undergraduate, at a certain point I decided that I wanted to do an ethnography of a social movement. And ethnography is what I was talking about before, participant observation. And ethnography is both the method of going out and living with a group of people for a long time and then writing it up. And so I decided that that's what I wanted to do. I had never read an ethnography of the social movement. I think they were just starting to come out at that point, Faye Ginsburg's early work, but I hadn't read anything. It was just something that I came up with. And I decided, yeah, why not? I can go work with the social movement and then write about it. And so as an undergraduate, I'd gotten interested in Latin America, largely because of U.S. involvement in Central America in supporting the Contras against the Sandinistas and the Salvadoran government and the death squads. And that was a direct result of my work with the peace movement. But I also got involved in Palestine-Israel issues for complicated reasons. We had this really great program where I went to school, and so I actually went and did a semester abroad. At that point, it was half in the West Bank and half in Jerusalem. And so I ended up, and I looked for a social movement, and the movement I ended up finding was called Yesh Gavul, which is a group of Israeli soldiers, Zionist and non-Zionist, who refused to serve in the occupied territories. And so that's where I did my first ethnography of a social movement. That was mostly based on interviews, but it worked. And so I was interested in Zionism as a hegemonic national identity and masculinity and how people could challenge that. And so then when I got back, I wrote that up, and that was, did really, really well and really had a good time doing that. I went off to Central America after graduating and thought that I would do a study of the Mayan movement in Guatemala, which was becoming really big at the time. So it was a kind of a cultural movement of people who were on the one hand fighting for political rights, but also fighting for cultural rights and for sort of a way to express their identity, not unlike the Aboriginal movement, say, for example, in Australia. And so I went to graduate school wanting to do an ethnography of that movement. When I got to graduate school, I found out two things. One is that every anthropologist in the world wanted to do that movement. This idea of anthropology of social movements was becoming big. A lot of people were coming at it from different angles. I mean, we could talk about why that's the case, but in any event. And also, I began to question relationships of power between anthropologists and the people that we study. So that's something that's been really big in anthropology starting in the 1980s. I ordinarily don't bother my introductory students too much with this issue. But needless to say, anthropology's origin was very much in a colonial context, whether it's in sort of the British colonial regime in Africa or U.S. expansionism and Native American populations. Anthropology had a kind of uncomfortable relationship with power and systems of domination. And so anthropologists have always been criticizing that to some extent. It's not fair to say that it started in the 80s, but this became really big in the 80s and into the 90s. And so I became uncomfortable with my relationship as a privileged white anthropologist in Guatemala, kind of objectifying a movement, particularly when there were so many of us doing the same thing. And so I decided that what would be more interesting would be to study people more like me, in a sense, taking anthropology and using it to study the self as much as the other. People were beginning to study up at that point, which meant studying people with power. I decided I wanted to study horizontally, I guess, neither up nor down. And so I also, in grad school, this was in the 1990s, there was a period when I wasn't sure what I wanted to study. And anthropology was also deep in its sort of postmodern mode at a certain point, where it was more important to sort of theorize about things than to actually change them. And I got a little disillusioned, so I took a couple of years off while I was living in San Francisco. Began to work with a non-governmental organization around health rights in Central America, and then other sorts of, got involved in sort of the political scene in San Francisco. And that's when the movement against the World Trade Organization happened, which the World Trade Organization is a global body that makes trade rules in ways that normally benefit large corporations and powerful countries at the expense of local communities. And the World Trade Organization was having a big meeting in Seattle. And I got involved because the Committee for Human Rights for Health Rights in the Americas, there was a move to privatize healthcare and education in Central America, and so we were opposing that. And so the World Trade Organization was the place where they were sort of discussing, barriers to that, and we wanted to make sure that that movements and governments in Central America could oppose privatization without having sort of penalties from the WTO applied to them. And so the WTO then became a kind of magnet for a lot of people who were fighting what became thought of as globalization, sort of privatization, structural adjustment, which we could talk about later. And so I got involved in that movement, and that's when the light went off. I was like, this is really interesting. I mean, I was really interested in Seattle in a lot of ways because of the kind of ritual dimension. we were doing this massive direct action, which involved, we were in a massive human chain surrounding the World Trade Organization meeting. We were organizing in things called affinity groups, which are these small groups of 5 to 15 people. And we had this very complicated kind of organizational structure. But for me, it was this feeling. What happened was there was a kind of, I guess we'll call it a police riot on the streets of Seattle, which now are quite common and had been common, but for a while, in the United States, they hadn't happened since the 60s. It was really interesting. On the one hand, exhilarating, and on the other hand, terrifying, and the emotional dynamics, and it was really this big sort of ritual. And I talk about this to my introductory class, I talk about sort of Victor Turner and this idea of liminality and this kind of time out of time. In our everyday lives, we follow the rules, and it becomes kind of constricting. And with the commodification of space in everyday life, to have a space where all the rules were off, there was this kind of sense of freedom. It was really interesting, and I wanted to study that. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, I was interested in globalization, and these protests sort of spread, first in the U.S. and Canada, then to Prague and to other parts of the world. And then I realized, well, these massive street protests have been going on in the global South forever. And so I got involved in this movement, and I had a partner at the time, actually from Spain, and she told me about this protest that was happening in Prague, and I got involved in a listserv, and I found this group in Spain, and so I realized, well, I could do that. I could study this movement. I could actually leave the U.S., which anthropologists are always trying to go elsewhere, but still study a group of people who are like me, and study this sort of evolving and developing social movement, and bring together my interest in the politics of globalization with my interest in kind of ritual and the body and meaning, and put this project together, and that's how I ended up doing it.
Do you think that the protests in Seattle, a very big historical event, do you think that your training in and background in anthropology shaped the way that you participated in that event and analysed it afterwards?
Yeah, the very fact that I had this idea of liminality in my head, I knew what I was feeling, but I could actually connect it to sort of concepts. That was kind of cool. And just the sort of, the thing about anthropology is that you learn how to understand the world from other people's perspectives. And the organizing model that we were using in Seattle, the consensus model, is all about that. It's all about learning how to organize together with people across difference and not impose a centralized model of how things should work, but in an interactive, intersubjective way. So to me, there was a relationship between my work as an anthropologist and the organizing model that we were using in Seattle. And then as the movement developed and it became thought of as the network of networks, the movement of movements, it was all about bringing together people across diversity and difference. And so an ethnographic or an anthropological perspective was really important, both in understanding what was happening, but also, that's what organizers do in these kinds of movements, is you go out and try to interact with people who are different from you and build and make connections. And that's very much what anthropologists are trying to do as well. And so it was just natural, I think.
So you've maintained, in your work now, you've maintained this focus on horizontal social movements or anti-globalisation movements. How would you define what exactly is the focus of your work in terms of what characterises these particular groups or movements? What bounds them as a focal point of your study?
I think there's two. One, there's a political aspect. I study movements, or I have, and this isn't the only way to do anthropology by any means, or the best or most important, but I study groups that allow me an opportunity to engage in the politics that I want to engage in. So my ethnography is both about knowledge production, but it's also about actual political engagement. And these are the movements that I'm attracted to politically, because I believe in that way of organizing, not intellectually so much, although I have intellectual justifications, but just viscerally. It's the way that I am, or want to be. Right? There are contradictions in myself and in these movements, for sure, and that's interesting anthropologically. But these are movements that I'm sort of naturally attracted to, because they're sort of trying to build a little bit of the world that we want to be building, right? That's the whole idea of prefiguration. So there's that. But intellectually, I find them interesting, precisely because it's not a new model, and horizontality has been around forever, but the scale at which these movements are organizing, I think, because of new technologies and because of globalization, I think it's happening on a scale that we haven't seen before, starting in the late 1990s and until now. And so I just think it's a fascinating phenomenon. Also, because these are movements where, they're often based on what I call, or what activists call, open spaces, where people are coming together from different sorts of movements. They're culturally fascinating. I just like places where you have people from different backgrounds coming together and interacting. I just find it interesting. Politically, I think it's productive, and anthropologically, it's interesting. I also like, I believe in power and struggle. And so I'm interested in movements that are challenging power, but also where there are internal dynamics. I like sort of participating in documenting an internal conflict. I don't know why. And I just find it fascinating. And so that's one of the things that I'm attracted to. And these movements provide all sorts of opportunities for that, because you've got people coming together from very different kinds of backgrounds. Mm-hmm. And so whereas all sorts of movements are important and interesting, but if it's just, say, studying the labor movement or something in isolation, to me that's not as interesting as seeing the labor movement interacting with the women's movement, interacting with the indigenous movement. It's those cross-cultural interactions that I'm interested in, as well as the specific kinds of practices that the movements are engaged in.
Just very broadly, in terms of our current moment, this present moment in time, what's the importance of these sorts of movements, and why study them as opposed to only participating in them?
Yeah. I think the movements are important for a lot of reasons. We're confronting sort of some pretty big issues. Whether it be climate change or inequality or what have you. We're at a stage where I think there always needs to be fundamental change. And so there's always a need for these sorts of movements, but it seems like we're rubbing up against the kind of tipping point, or maybe we're past the tipping point. But that's a whole different issue. And so I think there need to be movements that point this out. And so institutional movements are around all the time, and that's important too. You need people who are in institutional positions to make policy and the like. But because democracies around the world, to the extent they can be called democracies, are so compromised these days by wealth and power, everyday people have very little access or input. And so there need to be movements that, at the very least, can point that out, right? We talk about movements as sort of shining a light on issues to bring up debate and discussion. So a lot of people, even my students, always often ask me, but a lot of these movements are doing crazy kinds of things, whether it's performing in the street or throwing, breaking windows and stuff like this. It's like, well, how is that going to make change? And I always tell them that the first thing is to sort of start a conversation about something. And so Occupy, for example, perhaps it hasn't been as sustainable as people would have liked, but it helped move forward a conversation, not just about inequality, but also about democracy and politics and how it can and should work and how it does work. And so I think that's the importance of these movements. As somebody who's always been frustrated with institutional channels just because I feel them constraining, while not, again, they're important that they exist, but I've always been attracted to non-institutional spaces. These movements occupy those spaces, and they help shine a light on sort of relationships of power. And without them, it's very hard to sort of question the way things are working. And that's how I say anthropology. Right? It's like the classic Margaret Mead, in a sense. You go to Samoa and figure out how sex and gender systems are working there, so you can then deconstruct them back here. Mm. Right? It's about sort of going back and forth between studying the other and studying the self, and that boundary. We talked about being in and out of the university. I'm always in and out. I think anthropologists are often in and out. Right? We're never quite comfortable where we are, and so we have to move between spaces. And that's what these kinds of movements do, in a sense. They're moving in and out. And so, that's one of the reasons I think they're important.
Mm-hmm. So in amongst the broad scope of these sorts of movements, Occupy has been one of your focal points. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So what is it that you find particularly interesting or different about Occupy, and particularly as an anthropologist looking at Occupy?
Occupy was interesting in a lot of reasons, but I think that we talked about space earlier. And in the United States, it's very uncommon for movements to sort of reclaim public space. We have this idea of the public square, and it exists maybe in 3 New England towns or something, but there's very little space for people to come together. And so just reclaiming that for public discourse, I think, was really interesting and important. At the same time, it was linked up with occupations around the world. So when I talk about Occupy, I talk about the Arab Spring. It certainly wasn't the same movement, very different contexts, fighting for very different things, but there was a similarity in the kind of structure and organization of the occupation of Tahrir Square that was similar to what then was happening in Spain and what was happening in the US. So that was kind of a puzzle. How is it that in all of these places these similar dynamics are happening? Is it that we're just imitating what's happening somewhere else? Is it that this is some kind of inherent or natural way that people organize? What is it about this? Is it something about the technologies that we're using? I just found that really interesting that it was happening. And again, it was a moment when people have been feeling more and more shut out. I mean, it's not new. People have been shut out of representative democratic systems forever, but the degree of it is people are becoming more and more cynical about it. And so Occupy was one response. And so there are some global dynamics that were interesting to me, how the movement sort of spread globally, and some very specific dynamics when it came to the United States in terms of, we had just seen the Tea Party that had arisen a couple of years earlier and this populism on the right. And so this became interesting to me. What is it, this populism on the left? Also, Occupy was in everybody's front yard. I mean, some people were critical of that. I think Hugh Gusterson, who's a well-known public anthropologist, said, "Oh, it's low-hanging fruit," because anybody could do it. But that was part of what was interesting. And so then another thing that was interesting is that a lot of anthropologists were part of this. The global justice movement too, but even more so Occupy. And certainly sociologists study social movements. There were lots of sociologists, but there seemed in the U.S. in particular, maybe you'll go to New York and talk to folks at the New School or something, but that was sort of a neurological center of the movement or something. There seemed to be some connection between anthropologists and Occupy that I was part of and also found really interesting and intriguing.
So you've written about, in terms of Occupy, but also other social movements, you've written about their presence in physical spaces, as you were mentioning earlier, but then you've also written about the online component or this kind of the logic of networking in terms of how these movements form and function and maintain themselves. So I'm interested in how anthropology can look at movements that are situated often primarily online, and whether you needed to redefine or reimagine what anthropological methodologies could be in order to look at that component of movements.
Yeah, I think yes and no. I mean, I think because I was doing a study that was both online and offline, I think you could do really interesting ethnographies of movements just online. And certainly you can do ethnographies online. I teach a class on cybercultures, and we read Tom Bolstorff's book on Second Life, for example, and Gabriella Coleman, who you guys might talk to. And she's not in New York anymore, actually. She's in McGill. But she just did a book on Anonymous, which is really interesting. A lot of that was online. But what was interesting is but there wasn't much written on that when I was first doing the anti-globalization movement. So I was looking at listservs, for example. There wasn't much theorization, so I just kind of did it. So on the one hand, it wasn't that different because I was also looking at these offline spaces and these physical spaces. And so I was using very traditional ethnography. But then I was following conversations in this online space. And so for me, it was kind of just almost an extension of what was happening in the physical world, and then the physical world was an extension of what was happening online. On the one hand, it doesn't change what you're doing, but on the other hand, it does. To the extent that you are, when you are spending a lot of time online, and I did some work in some forums and chat rooms, there's a kind of disembodiedness and embodied. So there's a disembodiedness to the extent that, you're looking at a screen, but then that's also an embodied act, right? So the body comes back in. But it's a very different emotional environment, where the sort of that intersubjective, that kind of emotional connection you build with people becomes harder. But then again, that's what people are experiencing who are engaging online. So in a way, you're experiencing the world as the people you're working with are experiencing the world. I mean, that's why I'm not particularly interested in just doing ethnographic work online. Whereas Tom Bolstorff in his book made the decision, I'm only going to be in Second Life. People don't just live in Second Life. They live in the real world and online. So for me, it's important to follow people back and forth, in sort of the multiple spaces where they are. So I think, and people are still theorizing like what difference it makes that we're online. But we've been studying mediated worlds forever, right? Whether it's people through cameras, through books, newspapers. I mean, anthropologists have been engaging media. And this is just sort of another kind of a mediated space. Is it new? Is it not? Yeah, I mean, it is and it isn't, I guess.
Do you think it will become an increasingly central focus of anthropology as a discipline?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, the anthropology of the internet and cyberspace is a huge and growing, I think, sort of subdiscipline or subfield. Yeah, I mean, as life takes place online, anthropologists go online, right? And so I think for sure.
Earlier, when you were talking about the sorts of topics that you became interested in as an anthropologist, you wanted to create a field of study that was something that you wanted to be participating in as well. This is interesting because you coined the term, or maybe developed the term, militant ethnography at some point. So I'm just wondering if you could give a description of what you mean by militant ethnography and how that's fed into your work, or come from your work, or both.
So a lot as I was influenced, Nancy Shepherd Hughes had this idea of militant anthropology. Her idea was a little different. She was doing research with women in northeastern Brazil and sort of structural violence and how economic conditions were leading them to basically, you know, when babies were dying, she realized that they weren't mourning as much as you might expect. And she began to theorize, you know, why that was in terms of the everyday experience of marginalization. But for her, so a militant anthropology was a kind of witnessing. And so I took this idea of militant, which is a long tradition in Latin America, you know, of sort of being a word of sort of political engagement, a kind of militancy, but not wanting to sort of focus on the witnessing, but rather the kind of participating part. And so I just used ethnography instead of anthropology. And so ethnography, which is always about participating in what you're doing and studying, but pushing the participation and pushing the political, pushing the militant side. So if what anthropologists do is sort of, if you're studying a ritual in, you know, Indonesia or Melanesia or somewhere, or in Malaysia, you know, you're participating in the ritual. Well, if your ritual is politics and a protest, then it's participating in that ritual. And it's pushing that participation. So it's not being afraid to actually be part of the organization of it. Not only because you want to be engaged in politics, but because if what you're interested in understanding is sort of what we call the logic of practice, right, and not just sort of creating a representation of what's happening, then you have to be part of the practice of organizing the protest. I'm looking at my book by Pierre Bourdieu right there. There's another influence, right? And so you kind of have to organize, or you don't really have a sense of how these movements work, right? So, you know, you can sit and theorize how the internet's affecting movements, but unless you're organizing on the internet and then going to a meeting, you don't really viscerally understand what's happening. And so the militant ethnography is both a way of doing politics, but it's a way of generating a better understanding of what's happening in the movement. So I defend it both on political, but also on intellectual terms, on academic terms, or epistemological terms.
So anthropology as a discipline kind of has a pretty tumultuous history in terms of grappling between how to be an objective observer, how to be a subjective participant, all of these things. So I'm wondering, in terms of your practice of militant ethnography, or your theories around militant ethnography, if there's ever any question of being compromised in terms of your anthropological work, if you're involved as a person with a very explicit political position, if not political agenda, within these sorts of movements.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I don't think that contemporary anthropology has too many sort of hang-ups about objectivity these days. There are complications that come from that we can talk about, and degrees of distancing that become important. But at least in sort of contemporary cultural, interpretive, critical anthropology, I don't think we go into the field with the idea that we're creating objective truth. Rather, we use our subjective experience as a way to explore certain dynamics in the world. So it's actually, you know, I talk about using, and Margaret Mead talked about this too, using the body as a research tool. So there has to be a distancing and an objective, sort of a thinking back on what one's doing in the field, but it's using the experience in the field to then reflect on the world and your place within it. And so it's not so much an objective account that I'm looking for as an account that is true to the context, I guess you would say, that represents what's happening to the best of my ability in terms of how I and other people are experiencing it. And then as part of, you know, what's become standard practice in ethnography is to reflexively reflect on your position in the field. And so I don't expect the reader to take my ethnographic portrait as truth, but I do expect them to understand who I am, where I'm coming from, and how I come about these observations, right? And so to be reflexive about the kinds of narratives that I'm putting together. And so on the contrary, I think that in a sense it's more objective to put one's position into the ethnography and to let the reader then critically reflect on what that relationship is, rather than saying, okay, I'm developing an objective account of what's happening. I mean, you know, maybe in some disciplines you can have a more or less objectivist account, though, you know, that's even a debate. In anthropology, it's impossible. And so I think what most anthropologists try to do is to sort of present one's relationship to the people in the field that they're working with and to let the reader in to the process. And that was part of the whole critique of ethnography in the 1980s. So there was a political critique of our relationship to the people we're studying with, but then there was an epistemological critique of the kind of writing that we were doing. And they're often connected. So a lot of us who are doing political kinds of anthropology also come out of that more kind of epistemological critique of what ethnography is, right? So again, it's not just a political statement, it's also an epistemological statement about the kinds of knowledge that we're producing. Now, that doesn't mean there's not a distancing, right? And so, it's almost easy while you're in it's not easy. In fact, my next book is actually going to be talking about some of the internal conflicts in this collective in Mexico that I had. But it's more easy when you're in the field to engage in this kind of militant ethnographic position. But then when you go back, and there's this sort of distancing where you then critically reflect on what you're doing in the field. And so it's not, I feel that you still do have to remove yourself in a relative fashion at that moment. And then re-engage at the moment of writing. So there's a whole complex discussion about, what are you writing, who are you writing for, and what happens to what you write, once you're back in the field that we can talk about if you want. But at a very basic level, I'm not particularly bothered by the non-objective side. I'm more bothered by the sort of more specific politics that then emerge from that, in a sense.
What qualities do you think someone needs to have to be a good anthropologist?
Just basic common sense and human. Yeah, right now I think
Just interested in
social skills. Not even social skills because you don't have to be very good socially. I think I think too an ability to make the strange familiar and the familiar strange, right? And that's the classic what anthropologists do. But to not take for granted things that are going on around you. Right, to see little things and to see that there's significance in what does Malinowski say, the minutiae, no, it's the word, the imponderabilia of everyday life, right? And then also a basic ability and desire to connect. I don't think you have to be particularly good at it in all situations, but you have to have an ability to overcome your inability. You have to kind of be able to figure out how to connect to people. Right, those two things. Because if you connect too well, then you're never going to make the strange, familiar strange, right? So I think it's those people who are sort of inside and outside, and who understand relationships, but also grapple with them. I think those are the best anthropologists in a sense. But I don't believe it's something you can learn, and that's why I have problems with my sociology friends who always want to teach methods classes. I'm a pretty classic anthropologist. You just go out in the field and figure it out. I think you can learn certain tricks. But if you think you know what you're doing, you're not going to stumble and you're not going to figure it out. So I think also an ability to sort of, to be able to be in uncomfortable situations. And that doesn't mean going off to some strange place. It could be right here in Boston.